The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
There is, I think, that real responsibility to notice how we are using language and to recognize that it is an instrument of power, that it does have the power to manipulate and to change things that happen and to change how people see each other and how they relate to each other, even in their own families. And so I think it's really difficult to overstate that responsibility.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Journalist Bonnie Kristian writes opinion pieces on foreign policy, religion, electoral politics, and more. Her column, The Lesser Kingdom, appears in print and online at Christianity Today. She's a fellow at Defense Priorities, a foreign policy think tank, and her work has been published at outlets including The New York Times, The Week, USA Today, CNN, Politico, Reason, and The Daily Beast. Her new book is Untrustworthy: The Knowledge Crisis Breaking Our Brains, Polluting Our Politics, and Corrupting Christian Community. She joined me to talk about epistemology, virtue, intellectual honesty, and the ways the internet has broken everybody's brain. Bonnie Kristian, I'm very glad to have you on the Habit Podcast today. Thank you for making time for me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I really enjoyed reading your new book, Untrustworthy. And I want to start with this idea that we are in an epistemological crisis that is breaking our brains, polluting our politics, and corrupting Christian community, to borrow from your subtitle. Epistemology is a hard word. It's a hard word to say. Let's just start there. What is epistemology?
Sure. So epistemology is a branch of philosophy, and it concerns the study of knowledge itself. So it's interested in a lot of things like what is knowledge, and what is the difference between, say, knowledge and fact, or knowledge and opinion, or conjecture. These kinds of delineations between different kinds of information or beliefs that we can hold within our heads. And so a lot of it is about figuring out, how do we say when we're justified in our beliefs? Like when is a belief supported, or in some cases we might even claim proven? When is it simply something that we're asserting? So epistemology asks those kinds of questions, and I think it's not something that most people are going to be thinking about on a daily basis. And I think under a lot of circumstances, it's not something that most people would ever really have to think about. If you're not an academic philosopher, you're probably not talking about epistemology on a day-to-day basis. But in our context, where there is so much confusion around what is knowable and what is true and who is trustworthy, I do think that epistemology becomes something that's important for a lot more of us because of the way that we are so constantly taking in information and assessing, or in many cases, not really assessing truth claims just all day long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You reference a study from 2019. Study was called The Perception Gap. And one of the most alarming things about that study to me was, or not just to me, to anybody who knows anything about it, is that the more well-informed you are, the more likely you are to view people who oppose you as insane or evil or sort of this caricature. There's something about, the information we're receiving is making us dumber in some important ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that study really highlights how distorting it is to engage in sort of the public sphere and politics, especially exclusively or overwhelmingly through taking in information, especially online, but taking it in through media and getting your idea of what a Republican is like or what a Democrat is like from like the crazy people who are yelling at you on Twitter, as opposed to your neighbor down the street or someone who goes to church with you who is across the party line, but really not that different from you. And so, we like, I think a lot of us like to think of ourselves as so well informed. Like, I keep up with the news. I know what's going on. I have a good idea of what the other side is like. But yeah, it was very striking that what this study found was that the more often people were consuming political media, the more caricatured their idea of their political opponents was.
And if you would help me close the gap between that idea and epistemology, right? How is that an epistemological matter?
Yeah, well, so I think it's part of a sort of a larger information environment that we have, which is very chaotic, very confusing, and crucially very overwhelming. So over the last 20, 30, 40 years, with the rise of 24-hour cable news, of modern talk radio, of course the internet and social media, we've enormously and very rapidly increased the amount of information we're taking in. And I think quality is an important aspect of it, but quantity is a really important aspect of it as well. There's just so much of it. And so what I would argue is that it's once you start taking in information and encountering information on that scale, it becomes much more difficult to be epistemically responsible, to be actually like interrogating the truth claims that you're encountering. And so for a study like that, what's happening is, you're consuming all this information about what your political opponents believe all day long and how bad their motives must be, because like no good and reasonable person could sincerely believe something like that. And it's just coming at you over and over and over. And it starts to, I think, outweigh those more ordinary, normal, real life human interactions that you should be having, that ideally would be balancing some of that out and reminding you that people who disagree with you politically are not just that one opinion that you disagree with. Yeah.
You mentioned it at one point, the rise of yard signs. And it never occurred to me until you mentioned it, but political yard signs are in some ways a way of introducing the dynamics of social media, the worst dynamics of social media, into our everyday neighborhood experience. Right? I think you said something like, I live in a nice neighborhood. I don't want it to be more like Twitter. So this opportunity to signal my position, my virtue, my whatever. And I mean, it's, the yard sign, more or less by definition, is a signaling mechanism. And I'd never thought about the extent to which that is sort of a as you said, introducing the social dynamics of Twitter into the real world, and it's kind of nasty when you think of it in those terms.
Yeah, it's been interesting. So since that portion of the book drew on an article I'd written about the subject for an outlet where I used to work, The Week. Mm-hmm. And when I wrote it, I lived in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and our neighborhood was deep, deep blue, just like 95, 97% Democratic. And so because there was so much political uniformity, the yard signs were all very consistent. They were all the same. Mm-hmm. And generally speaking, if you lived there, you could assume what your neighbor's politics would be. And so I think in that context, people were using them to send those signals, to sort of draw those boundaries, announce themselves as a certain good type of people. But they could do so and not really expect any like controversy or mm-hmm. conflict to come of that. And so since then, we've moved to Pennsylvania, to Pittsburgh, which mm-hmm. is much more purple. Mm-hmm. And so here, there's not as many yard signs, mm-hmm. and the yard signs that are there are much more mixed in content. And it's been interesting, like moving here, thinking about, meeting neighbors and like to walk up to a house with a sign announcing, I don't think like you, and maybe I don't super like people who think like you. Like that makes it much harder to meet neighbors when it's already hard to meet neighbors. And it's been interesting to see, like, there are fewer signs here. And I think part of it is because you have to be maybe a little bit more hardcore about it to be willing to so announce your differences when you know that there are people who have differences mm-hmm. around you, which of course makes it even more of an interesting prospect when someone has decided I'm going to go that far and put this out in my yard.
Yeah. Well, now I don't remember the terminology you use in your book, but our so much of our political identity is defined these days by what we disapprove of rather than what we mm-hmm. approve of, and so to put a yard sign is not just to say here's what I believe, but to imply, or it's easy for somebody seeing that sign to assume that what you really mean is you don't like mm-hmm. certain people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, especially the classic "in this house we believe" sign, which was the one that was overwhelming in our Minnesota neighborhood. It's all phrased in like it's not just I support this guy for this election. It's like big moral principles that mm-hmm. are sort of timeless. And if you don't agree with everything on the sign, like, do they want to be friends with you? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you mean by, as you said, epistemology is a pretty academic term, mm-hmm. and the more you explain what epistemology is in detail, the more daunting it becomes, frankly. And yet, thankfully, you have a chapter called Practical Epistemology. Basically, a way of thinking about epistemology where it's not just invisible, but it's also is something that can be a sort of a working epistemology. So can we talk about that? Like, what do you mean by a practical epistemology, and how might we practice a practical epistemology?
Sure, yeah. So a lot of modern academic epistemology is very technical and very like intricately logical, and they do sort of like little, I almost want to call it like a word problem, like from elementary school math, where it's like this little scenario, and like if you're in this scenario, are you justified in claiming you have knowledge? And let's tease out why or why not. And I think, nothing against that. That can be interesting for a lot of people, but that's not super helpful for when you're sitting down and you're looking at something on the internet and thinking, is this real? How do I know if this is real or not? Mm. And so a lot of what I'm interested in doing is actually going back to an older model of epistemology, which is that if you go back towards especially like the medieval and early Christian eras, when they're doing sort of like early epistemology, and I probably should know, I don't actually know how old the word is, but when they're doing epistemology in prior centuries, a lot of it is very much concerned with virtue. It's not really about the knowledge so much as it is about you as the knower. What kind of knower will you be? Will you be coming to information, really flippantly or carelessly, looking just for bits of fact or data that support what you already want to say, or are you, trying to come to your study with intellectual honesty and with a studious mindset and this sort of thing. And that's something, that anyone can cultivate. Any of us can cultivate intellectual virtues, that you don't have to be an academic philosopher to be interested in stuff like that. And so a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about at the end of the book in that chapter and in the one that follows, which is also of that more practical bent, is about thinking, how do we develop intellectual virtues, and how do we develop a balance between recognizing that there is objective truth to be known, and God did make us capable of knowing it, capable of learning, capable of communicating to one another, while also recognizing the very real limits in our ability to do that well in any given moment. Anything from just lacking informational context to like your last meal is not sitting well and you can't process the book you're reading.
Yeah. And it seems to me a big part of that kind of virtue is a willingness to say, I will conform my self, my life, my thinking to a reality that I didn't invent, rather than using language and ideas and facts loosely defined as a way of solidifying my position or exerting power over other people or, whatever. I mean, that idea of a reality that I didn't create and that I have some accountability to, even if I can't fully grasp it, seems like a pretty helpful place to start or live or something.
Well, and I think that, particularly online in the age of social media, the way that everything is so gamified and designed to encourage, acquisition of followers and acquisition of attention, all of that, and particularly once you get into like a political space, all of it is so designed to make you want to just focus on growing and winning and accumulating, and none of that is, none of that encourages any sort of accountability to some greater truth than just the point you're trying to score against someone who insulted you online. And so this is why, to go back to the very beginning of our conversation, under a lot of circumstances, most people do not have to think about epistemology, but the way that we have chosen to live, I think that we do.
Yeah. Well, I do think, I remember when I was in graduate school, in the early to mid 90s, and was, having to read Derrida, Michel Foucault, and those kinds of things. This was shocking stuff. These ideas, shocking to me, these ideas of there's no real meaning, that language is just a way of exerting power and positioning yourself, that kind of stuff. It's all shocking stuff. And now it seems like people's grandmothers are posting that kind of stuff all the time. Assessing truth claims of people they disagree with in terms of, well, this is just, they don't necessarily use they don't exactly sound like Jacques Derrida, but they kind of do. This idea that no particular interest in what is actually true, but rather how can we, again, exert power? How can my team win?
Yeah, or a lot of times I think you see sort of like a resignation about it. Well, we'll never know anyway, so I'm just going to go with this because this sounds right to me. And that's almost more depressing because you're combining like, I'm going to pick what's good for my team with, at the same time, just totally dispensing with any pretense of even like trying to find out what might be true.
Yeah. So what is this is a podcast, by the way, for writers. We are interested in questions of writing and creative work. I shouldn't say it's for writers, but a lot of writers, I hope, listen. What is the writer's responsibility in these regards? Knowing that people perhaps take the position of, I guess we'll never know, so we might as well just pick some facts that work for our team.
Yeah. Well, so there's early on in the book, I quote a passage from Dorothy Sayers, which she's talking about language as a tool of power, and as a tool that most of us are not really trained to use. And she's talking about it as like a skill. I think as I've noted when I have used this quote in other places, like it does sound very elitist to say like not everyone knows how to use words well, but that is true. It's something anyone can learn, but it's not something we're all born knowing. And so I think for people who are writing or otherwise like creating art, putting content out into the world, to use a terrible phrase, and to some degree that's like a position anyone can be in now, right? But especially for people who are doing it full time and professionally, there is, I think, that real responsibility to notice how we are using language and to recognize that it is an instrument of power, that it does have the power to manipulate and to change things that happen and to change how people see each other and how they relate to each other, even within their own families. And so I think it's really difficult to overstate that responsibility. It's a responsibility, I think, that sort of the average person posting up on Facebook all the time, sharing their political articles that they come across. I don't know how much they really think about that as like that they have this a responsibility to take care in what they're doing. And to some extent, it's understandable that might not be something the average like grandma Facebooking isn't thinking about, but certainly as writers, it is something that we should be thinking about quite a lot.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of topics that come to mind when you mention these things. One is, as you said, words have power, and I think it's helpful to do some thinking if you're going to write about the distinction between realities that we can make, that there are realities that we can make through language, right? We can change people's inner landscapes through language. And then there are other realities that we can't make through, like there are realities that we didn't make, that no human being made. And it's one thing to depict realities that we didn't make, and to align ourselves and help others to align with the realities that we didn't make. And then it's another thing to use language to make new realities, social realities, cultural realities. I haven't thought through all the distinctions between those two things and how I remember, I think it was Joseph Pieper who remarked that self-interest is the great enemy of reality. Right? We have lots of ways of avoiding reality for the sake of our own self-interest, our perceived self-interest, which we're not always very good at knowing what our actual self-interest is. That wasn't a question, was it? That was just
No, that's well, I have a response to it, even if it's not a question. Excellent. So I have a chapter in the book about conspiracism, like as a mindset that's prone towards very suspicious thinking. And for part of that chapter, I interviewed a handful of pastors who had encountered this in their churches. And one of the things that one of the pastors commented was that, sometimes when he's in the right relational context with someone who's really gotten deep into this mindset, and usually it takes quite a long time to get there, but sometimes he reaches a point where he can say, like, is this bearing good fruit in your life? And if they can be honest with themselves, they can usually recognize, no, it's not bearing good fruit. Like, it's tearing up my relationships. It's making me a more unpleasant person. It's making me, preoccupied with things that I can't do anything about. And I think that same question is always going to be apt for, assessing our own writing output, like from the mindset of someone who's like a reader. If someone is reading all of my work, is that going to bear good fruits in their life? And if the answer is no, then we've gotten ourselves in a pretty rough position.
Yeah. Okay. That actually is a helpful rubric for thinking about insofar as I can create realities, maybe, not big R reality, but there are realities I can create through language, or those realities that I that are moving the world, or my little world.
Yeah, if someone is reading everything I write, are they coming away angrier? Are they coming away, embittered? Are they coming away caring more or less about, about figuring out what is true? And I think those are questions we can probably, again, if we're willing to be honest with ourselves, give a pretty reasonable answer to.
Yeah. Another thing that you were talking a minute ago, another set of categories that seemed interesting and helpful, which you talk about in your book, is somehow we've got to a place where we're both gullible and cynical, which is sort of the worst of all possible worlds when it comes to knowledge. That we're supposed to be both gullible, ready to believe anything that makes the other team look bad or makes my team look good, and yet cynical.
That combination comes from a Hannah Arendt quote, where she talks about people reaching a point where they will at the same time believe everything and nothing, think that everything was possible and nothing was true. And when I read that, it was so recognizable for people's responses to like news reports in recent years, where some perfectly accurate report will come out, just like standard reporting. So and so said this. They're going to pass this law, whatever. And it's like I don't believe it. And then some crazy, completely made up story will make the rounds on social media. It's like, well, it's possible. You can't prove that it didn't happen. Like that combination. And it's all very much dependent on like who is making the claim about what happened. Right. What do I want to be true? And we tend to think of like gullibility and cynicism as these two opposite things, but it really does seem that in many cases we are starting to combine them in the worst way.
Yeah. Okay, you propose a thought experiment that I found I don't know if it was supposed to be funny. I thought it was funny. But you said, imagine, if you think about the number of news articles that we share around thanks to social media, the frictionlessness of social media. And you say, imagine if in 1995 you wanted to share that many articles with all your friends, what that would involve. And you said you'd read the newspaper, you'd clip out the interesting articles, you would then take them to someplace to copy them, then you put them in an envelope, then you put stamps, and you address them to 100 people and send them out. And then the next day you do it all over again. Just not many years ago, to do that would make you an absolute crank.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember sometimes like someone would send me, just me personally, like one newspaper clipping. And I'd be like, why would you send me a piece of the newspaper? Like, can you, like, this is weird. Can you not? Yeah. And now we do it all day long to everyone we know.
Yeah. Can you say more about that? It seems really significant. I can't quite put my finger on what's so significant about it, except, again, it used to be, you'd have to be an insane person to do that.
Clipping newspapers was strange.
Yeah.
I mean, so of course the technology difference does matter, and the time that it takes you to do that does matter. Like, these are not identical, but I think that there is actually more similarity than we want to admit, and we can't just wave it all away and say, well, because it only takes me 5 minutes instead of 3 or 4 hours, it's fine and I can do it. There's just something a little off, as there always was, about all of us setting ourselves up as like these little mini town criers, where we're not content to just let the media, publish these stories, and maybe you chat about it a little bit at work, but like this feeling that we have to be the distributors of this information also, and that we're somehow helping by doing that. It's just a very rapid and very strange shift to me. I think that as a society, we would have all sort of decided it is now a good and normal thing for me to essentially clip newspapers all day, every day, and ask other people to read them. I think that maybe we never were able to sort of articulate a reason why we would call someone who did that a crank, but I think that was not a fundamentally wrong instinct. And now we are, by that standard, a society of cranks.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've often thought about the dangers of frictionlessness that the internet offers. And when I first started hearing about blogs and how easy it was to do a blog, I thought about, and actually when I started a blog briefly in 2010 or whatever it was, I started thinking about that scene, or the fact of the Great Divorce, that in hell, if you wanted a new house, you just think a new house. You didn't have to go to the trouble of actually building a house, paying for a house. You just think it, which sounds like a dream come true, except that if you had a conflict with your neighbor, instead of working out with your neighbor, you just think yourself a new house. And that frictionlessness was part of the punishment, or the self-punishment, really, of hell in Lewis's vision in The Great Divorce. And it led to, oddly enough, this weird isolation, right? Because I don't have to deal with the friction of the social friction of living with people. I just think myself a new house, and then hell turns into this big donut of everybody leaving the center and moving out. And when Facebook and Twitter came along, it felt like this was going to be, this frictionlessness was going to be a way to make society better. And
we thought it was going to be, make new friends and be a better citizen and all of this sort of thing.
I will say I do know a little more about people I went to high school than I would have.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not opposed to the internet. I use the internet all day long for my job. I wouldn't have my career without the internet. But I think it's like a sharp knife. It has real uses, but it is very dangerous. And I think we sort of rushed headlong into this thing without really taking seriously the idea that, we talked early on about like stranger danger and don't put your real name online. That wasn't actually the risk. Like the risk was not abduction. The risk was that, your whole attention and day is consumed by this. It was not like our bodies were not stolen, but our brains were, and our time was. And I think we just sort of ran into this and thought it'll be fine. And, we reaped many benefits, but now we have this increasingly frictionless situation. There's just so few limits, and it is directly counter in many cases to sort of the whole model of how, like Facebook and Twitter and the like, how they make their money to introduce friction. And so this is why I, in the book, keep coming back to virtue, because I do not think that we can sort of wait around for, Twitter's going to introduce some big fix that's going to force me to behave myself on there, because they're not. I think what we can change is how we are behaving in these spaces.
How do you behave better when your brain has been rewired by these things?
I mean, a lot of it. And so the chapter directly after the practical epistemology chapters is all about habits and assessing, like, how am I using my time? How am I directing my attention? I think for those of us who are very online and who have grown up, my generation, I didn't have the internet in high school, but I've had the internet since college. And for adults who've had a large portion of their working lives with the internet, and especially younger people, I don't think this is something that we're ever going to be able to stop paying attention to, and sort of constantly reorienting our habits so that we are still able to, say, sit down and read a book and not just have, without picking up our phones in between every chapter section. So I think a lot of it is about being very deliberate about our habits and making spaces in our, like making our brains capable of building those virtues. Like you can't just sit down and be like, I'm going to be virtuous now. Unfortunately, it does not work that way, whether here or anywhere, but we can we can be more careful with our habits and where we're putting our attention, and at least create opportunities for those virtues to develop. And so a lot of that is about time use. A lot of it is about what we're reading and watching. And none of that is easy, but the one more hopeful thing I think is that there is increasing recognition that something is wrong here. And maybe for those of us who are aware of that, even if it's something that we have to pay attention to, even if our brains are always a little bit broken for the rest of our lives, at least we do go into this with the next generation, with our children and grandchildren, much better informed than our parents could have been, because we've experienced what it's like to have our brains messed up by the internet and have at least greater knowledge of how to avoid that.
Do you expect for our brains to be broken for the rest of our lives?
I think there's a lot we can do. I would sort of be surprised if we ever went back to having a pre-internet brain, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's possible. Maybe if you can go off grid, maybe after 15, 20 years of that, you'll go back to it. But I mean, we know that brains remain like somewhat plastic in adulthood, and so I think changes can be made, but that also means that I think it literally our physical brains have been changed by how we consume information.
Yeah. I can definitely tell a difference in the way my brain works. I mean, I was good and grown, had several kids before the internet. I spent much time on the internet, and I'm not, I can definitely tell a difference in the way my brain works.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that I think about, like my habits and attention use and attention span. It's something that I think about certainly weekly, if not daily, like a lot. The phone is always there. It's always got new stuff on it. I certainly still read books and read them in their entirety and can read them at long stretches, undisturbed. But when I think about the way I read in high school, and some of that is, like I have different responsibilities now, but some of it is definitely my brain.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes, my wife she doesn't spend much time at all on almost no time on social media. And, but she'll come home from work, and I'll tell her, about a news story. So tell me more about that. And then I realized I didn't read that news story. I only read a headline,
I saw the headline. Yeah.
Okay. I want to, this is now just, I'm completely change the subject. This is not a segue, but I want to talk about something else from your book before we run out of time. And that is this prayer of Aquinas that you prayed every day as you were writing this book. And hopefully you have it at hand, or maybe it's in your brain if you prayed it every day. I don't know.
It got close. I don't think I have it quite memorized. But there's always like one line in the middle that throws me off.
Well, tell me about that. Tell me about that prayer and why and how it shaped your work.
Yeah, so it's called A Prayer for Students, and I believe that the version that I have is certainly a modern translation, and it might be, I think it's part of some larger piece of writing of his. But basically, he prays to God to, sort of address while he's studying to he calls it the double darkness of sin and ignorance. And so as he's coming to in many cases the biblical text or whatever else he was studying, to sort of let him move past not only sort of those like innocent lapses of ignorance, but also sin, which I think goes to a lot of what we've been talking about of, looking for what you want instead of what's actually there. And it's also just a very practical prayer. He asks for things like a retentive memory and the ability to grasp things correctly and fundamentally. and for help in like finishing his work.
Mm-hmm.
And so I came across it. I forget exactly at what point when I was writing, but I started praying it every day. Particularly, I finished the book in a sort of a several week sprint where I was doing it full time all day, every day. Particularly in that time, I was praying it daily, and I was drawn to it just by how clearly like a writer's prayer it was,
Mm-hmm.
and also by how much there you're not like feeling it every day. Like there are days when I didn't particularly want to pray before I started writing, or just sort of felt out of it, or like I was not coming to the work at my best. And so at that point, it was sort of a way to set my intentions for the day as I, like in my best moments, wanted them to be,
Mm-hmm.
even if in that moment they weren't necessarily quite that good. And it's not it's not magic, right? Like you can't just say the words and then you are that kind of person. But again, returning to the themes of habit to help you build virtue.
Mm-hmm.
That was at least my hope and my intent.
Yeah. Right. All right. Well, will you tell me some writers who make you want to write, Bonnie?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that since you sent that question over. And I think I have like sort of two categories of answers.
Right.
So one I would say is writers whose work tends to be very brief and very not dumbed down, but simple, and with sort of a timeless feel. I think some of C.S. Lewis's stuff gets into this range. And I would also say, while I was researching this book, I read a book by a guy named Jonathan Rauch called Kindly Inquisitors. I think the subtitle is The New Attack on Free Thought, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote it in the 1990s. But it was very striking how of the moment it felt. Like if you sort of took out a few specific examples he gave, it could have been written anytime almost in the last century.
Huh.
And so that kind of writing where it just seems like so broadly apt, and again, not ever stupid, but accessible and with a real staying power, I think, that many books do not have. So that's one. And then the other category I'd point to is for my reading for pleasure, I tend to read a lot of mystery novels.
Really?
Yeah, it's my thing. I would say probably Dorothy Sayers would be my top pick for that. But right now I'm reading some P.D. James, and obviously the work I do is very, very different. I don't really think I could ever write fiction, but yeah, that a really well done, especially mystery novel, has that draw that makes you want to come back to it and get to the end and find out what happened. And so I don't exactly know if I could characterize what that same effect looks like in nonfiction argued opinion.
Yeah, right.
But that quality certainly of just like a magnetic attraction almost.
Yeah. It's always fun to hear when writers do one kind of work and they're inspired and energized by another kind of work that they're never going to do. I hear from a lot of writers who will never write a song, but it's the songwriters who make them want to go write it.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, Bonnie Kristian, thank you so much. I so appreciate your insights in this book. In so many places, you're saying things that I kind of knew and felt but didn't have the words for, and so it was really helpful to me to read your book and borrow your categories, and I'll be using your categories, some of which were yours, some of which you're borrowing from somebody else, obviously, for years to come. So thank you for that, and thanks for being here.
Well, yeah, thank you. It was a great conversation.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. To check out more of our podcasts, visit rabbitroom.com/podcast. Our work at the Rabbit Room would be impossible without the generous support of our membership. If you'd like to learn more about membership at the Rabbit Room, visit rabbitroom.com/member. And thanks for listening.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.